The dust rose in choking clouds around Josephine Wright's boots as she pressed her back against the ranch house wall, Winchester rifle hot in her hands, and knew with absolute certainty that the next hour would either see her dead or prove she was too stubborn to be moved from the last acre of land her husband had bled into before fever took him 6 months past. The sun beat down merciless on Terlingua, Texas, this September morning in 1878, turning the scrubland into a shimmering hell that made the 5 men riding toward her property shimmer like demons rising from the earth itself. Josephine was 24 years old, her dark hair plastered to her neck with sweat beneath the wide-brimmed hat that had once belonged to Thomas, and she had not eaten more than cornbread and wild rabbit for 3 weeks because she'd spent her last dollars on ammunition. The riders came closer, their horses picking careful paths through the rocks and creosote bushes that dotted her land. She recognized the lead man, Garrett Vance, a land speculator from El Paso who had been circling her property like a vulture ever since Thomas died. He wanted the water rights to the small spring that bubbled up on the eastern edge of her 100 acres, the only reliable water source for 20 miles in any direction. Without it, the Wright Ranch was just another patch of dust and dreams. With it, Vance could control every cattleman and homesteader in the region. Josephine's hands steadied on the rifle as she watched them approach. She had fired warning shots twice before when Vance's men had tried to intimidate her, but today felt different. Today they rode with purpose, and she counted the gun belts they wore with a sinking feeling in her stomach. She stepped out from the shadow of the house onto the porch, positioning herself where they could see her clearly. The rifle came up to her shoulder in one smooth motion, and she sighted down the barrel at Vance himself. "That's far enough," she called out, her voice carrying across the dry air. "You know the property line, Vance. You crossed it about 50 yards back." The riders pulled up, their horses snorting and stamping in the heat. Vance pushed his hat back, revealing a florid face that spoke of too much whiskey and too little conscience. He was maybe 40 years old, thick around the middle, with eyes that calculated everything in terms of profit and loss. "Now, Mrs. Wright," he said, his tone falsely pleasant, "is that any way to greet neighbors who have come to make you a generous offer?" "I've heard your offers before," Josephine said, keeping the rifle steady. "The answer's still no." "Be reasonable, woman. You can't hold this land alone. No crops, no cattle, no man to work it. You're barely surviving out here. I'm offering you $200, enough to set yourself up proper in town, maybe find work as a seamstress or schoolteacher." "This land's worth 10 times that, and you know it," Josephine said. "And I'm holding it just fine on my own." One of the other riders, a lean man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, spat tobacco juice onto her land. "Ain't proper for a woman alone out here, liable to get herself into trouble." "Only trouble I see is sitting on horses in front of me," Josephine replied. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, and she saw Vance notice the movement. "Mrs. Wright, I'm trying to be civilized about this," Vance said, and now the false pleasantness was draining from his voice. "But my patience has limits. Winter's coming. You think you can make it through on rabbit meat and stubbornness. The bank in El Paso holds the note on this land, and I happen to know you're 3 months behind on payments." Josephine's jaw tightened. He was right about that, damn him. The bank had been patient so far, but their patience was measured in calendar months, not human sympathy. "I'll make the payments," she said. "I've got time until November. That's only 2 months away. Where you going to find that kind of money? That's my concern, not yours." The scarred man's hand drifted toward his gun belt. Josephine swung the rifle toward him. "Don't," she said flatly. "I can reload and fire this Winchester faster than any of you can clear leather. First bullet's got your name on it, friend." The man's hand froze, and Josephine saw him glance at Vance for guidance. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind hissing through the scrub grass and the creak of saddle leather as one of the horses shifted weight. Then Josephine heard new hoofbeats, coming fast from the south. She didn't dare take her eyes off Vance and his men, but her peripheral vision caught a single rider approaching at a gallop. The horse was a big roan gelding, and the man astride it sat his saddle like he'd been born there. He came up fast and hard, pulling the roan to a sliding stop between Josephine's porch and Vance's group, effectively putting himself in the line of fire. Josephine's heart jumped into her throat. She couldn't shoot without risking hitting this stranger, and Vance's men suddenly had cover to draw their weapons. But the newcomer didn't seem concerned. He sat easy in the saddle, a tall man in his late 20s with sun-darkened skin and sandy hair that needed cutting. He wore a work-worn shirt and canvas pants, and there was a Colt revolver on his hip that looked well-maintained but not showy. A bedroll and saddlebags suggested he'd been traveling for a while. "Afternoon," the stranger said pleasantly, as if he'd just wandered into a church social instead of a standoff. "I seem to be lost. This the right ranch?" Josephine kept her rifle trained past him at Vance. "Who's asking?" The man half turned in his saddle so he could see both parties, a neat trick that kept him from presenting his back to anyone. Up close, Josephine could see his eyes were a light gray color, almost silver in the harsh sunlight, and they were taking in every detail of the situation with quick intelligence. "Name's Samuel Frost," he said. "I'm looking for work. Heard in town there might be a ranch out here that needed a hired hand." "You heard wrong," Vance said sharply. "There's no work here. Mrs. Wright was just about to accept my offer to buy her out." Samuel Frost's eyes flicked to Josephine, and she saw the question in them. She made a split-second decision based on nothing more than the fact that this stranger had ridden straight into danger without showing fear, and that he had the weathered hands of a man who knew honest work. "Actually," Josephine said, lowering her rifle slightly but not entirely, "I could use a hand. We were just discussing terms when Mr. Vance here decided to trespass on my land." Samuel nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. He turned his attention fully to Vance. "Sounds like the lady's not interested in selling. Might be best if you and your men moved along." The scarred man laughed, a harsh sound. "Might be best if you kept riding, Drifter. This doesn't concern you." "Well, see, if I'm hired on, it does concern me," Samuel said. His voice remained mild, but Josephine saw his right hand rest casually on his thigh, inches from his gun. "And I take my responsibilities seriously." Vance studied Samuel with narrowed eyes. "I don't know you. You're not from around here." "Been working ranches up Colorado way," Samuel said. "Came south looking for warmer winters. Heard Terlingua might have opportunities." "The only opportunity here is for Mrs. Wright to show some sense and take my offer before she loses everything to the bank," Vance said. He looked at Josephine again. $200, final offer. "You've got until tomorrow noon to think it over. After that, I'll be talking to the bank directly." He wheeled his horse around without waiting for a response, and his men followed suit. They rode back toward the property line at an easy walk, not hurrying but making it clear. They considered the confrontation concluded on their terms. Josephine kept the rifle ready until they disappeared over a rise, then let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands started to tremble with delayed reaction, and she lowered the Winchester quickly before Samuel could notice. Samuel dismounted in one fluid motion, keeping his horse between himself and the direction Vance had gone. He was taller than she'd thought, maybe 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean build of a man who worked hard and ate irregular. There was a long, healed scar along his jawline, and his hands were indeed calloused and weathered. "Thank you," Josephine said, then immediately felt foolish. "Though I had the situation under control." Samuel's mouth quirked. "Yes, madam, I could see that. But 5 against 1 are poor odds even for someone who handles a rifle like you do. You really looking for work?" "I am, and I heard true in town that you might need help." Old man at the general store mentioned the Wright ranch was short-handed. "The Wright ranch has exactly one hand, and that's me," Josephine said. She studied him carefully, trying to read whether he was honest or just another kind of trouble. "I can't pay much. Room and board and maybe a few dollars a month once I can scrape it together." "Room and board's enough for now," Samuel said. "I'm not particular about wages if the work's honest." Josephine wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to grab onto this unexpected help like a drowning woman grabbing a rope. But she'd learned hard lessons in the 6 months since Thomas died about trusting too quickly. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "You could get paying work at any of the big ranches around here. Why work for a widow who can barely feed herself?" Samuel looked at her steadily with those gray eyes. "Because those big ranches aren't being threatened by land speculators. Because I know what it's like to lose something that matters. And because I don't like men who try to intimidate women, even if it's 5 against 1 with the law probably in the speculator's pocket." There was something in his voice when he mentioned losing something that mattered, a thread of old pain that Josephine recognized because she carried the same pain herself. She made her decision. "All right," she said, "but I need to be clear. This is my land, my decisions. I'm not looking for someone to come in and take over." "Wouldn't expect to," Samuel said. "You're the boss. And I'm not interested in anything but honest work and honest help." Samuel nodded, understanding her unspoken concern. A widow and a stranger working together would provide enough gossip for the town as it was, without any impropriety added to it. "I'll bed down in the barn," he said. "Keep things proper." Josephine felt her shoulders relax slightly. "There's a lean-to on the south side, stays cooler. You can set up there. I hope you weren't expecting much for dinner. Supplies are thin right now." "I've got some supplies in my packs," Samuel said. "Real coffee and some beans. We can pool resources." The mention of real coffee made Josephine's mouth water. She'd been drinking roasted chicory root for weeks. "Then you're hired, Mr. Frost. Welcome to the Wright Ranch, such as it is." Samuel smiled for the first time, a genuine expression that made him look younger. "Call me Samuel, and I promise you, Mrs. Wright, I'll earn my keep." "Josephine," she said, making the decision to offer her first name as a gesture of trust. "If we're going to be working together, we might as well use Christian names." Samuel extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Josephine shook it. His grip was firm and calloused, the handshake brief and businesslike. But as she met his eyes, she felt something shift inside her, a tiny crack in the walls she'd built around herself since Thomas died. She pushed the feeling away quickly. She couldn't afford to be soft, couldn't afford distractions. This was strictly business, a matter of survival. The work started immediately. Samuel walked the property line with Josephine, having her point out the boundaries and explain the layout of the land. The ranch was small by Texas standards, only 100 acres, but in this arid country, that was still a significant piece of territory. The spring that Vance coveted bubbled up near a cluster of cottonwood trees on the eastern edge, creating a small green oasis in the brown landscape. "This is what he really wants," Josephine said, gesturing to the spring. "The land itself is barely worth farming, not enough grass for a big herd, but the water's worth everything." Samuel knelt by the spring, cupping his hand to drink. The water was cool and sweet, a precious commodity in this desert country. How much does it produce? Enough to water a couple hundred head of cattle plus whatever horses and domestic needs. It's never run dry, not even in the worst drought years. Thomas's father drilled down and found it comes from a deep aquifer. So Vance gets this, he controls who drinks and who doesn't. Exactly. He could charge whatever he wants or just keep it for his own operations and squeeze everyone else out. Samuel stood, wiping his wet hand on his pants. Then we make sure he doesn't get it. The simplicity of his statement, the certainty in his voice, made something warm unfurl in Josephine's chest. She'd been alone for so long, making every decision, carrying every burden. Having someone say, "we," instead of "you," was a gift she hadn't realized she desperately needed. They walked back to the ranch house as the sun started its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The house itself was small, built of adobe and wood with a covered porch across the front. The barn was more of a shed, really, barely large enough for 2 horses and some stored equipment. The lean-to Samuel would use as quarters was a 3-sided structure that at least offered shade and protection from the worst of the weather. "It's not much," Josephine said, hearing the defensive note in her own voice. "It's honest," Samuel replied. "That's more than a lot of places can claim." That night, they sat on the porch as the temperature finally dropped to something bearable. Samuel had been as good as his word about the supplies. They'd cooked beans with a little precious bacon, and the smell of real coffee brewing over the fire had made Josephine almost dizzy with anticipated pleasure. It was the best meal she'd had in months. "You said you worked ranches in Colorado," Josephine said, cradling her tin cup of coffee like it was liquid gold. "What brought you south?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, staring out at the darkening landscape. "Had a place of my own up there. Small operation, nothing fancy. Built it up over 5 years, had some good breeding stock, was starting to turn a profit." He paused, took a sip of coffee. "Then we had a bad winter. Lost most of the herd. I borrowed to restock, figured I could make it up the next year, but that winter was worse. Lost the herd and the land both to the bank." "I'm sorry," Josephine said softly. "Taught me something about banks and debts," Samuel continued. "They don't care about weather or bad luck or how hard you work. They care about payments on schedule. That's why when I heard in town about your situation, I figured I understood what you're up against." 3 months behind on payments, Josephine admitted. "The bank in El Paso has been patient, but there's a limit. November 1st, I need to come up with $150 or they'll foreclose." Samuel whistled low. "That's a lot of money in 2 months. I know. I've been trying to figure out how. Can't sell cattle because I don't have any. Can't sell crops because nothing's growing. I was thinking maybe I could take in laundry from the miners, do some sewing work, but even that wouldn't be enough." "What about the water?" Josephine looked at him sharply. "What about it? You said it's valuable. What if you sold water rights? Not to Vance, but to the other ranchers and homesteaders around here. Charge a fair price for access to the spring." "I couldn't do that. People need water to survive." "I'm not saying cut them off," Samuel said patiently. "I'm saying charge for it. Not robbery prices like Vance would, but enough to cover your costs and make your payment. Think about it. You're providing a service, maintaining the spring, keeping it clean and accessible. That's worth something." Josephine considered this, turning it over in her mind. It went against her instincts to charge neighbors for something as basic as water. But Samuel was right that maintaining the spring took work, and if she lost the land to the bank, Vance would buy it up and charge whatever he wanted anyway. "Maybe," she said slowly. "I'd have to think about how to approach people without seeming like I'm trying to gouge them. We could ride out tomorrow, talk to the nearest neighbors, explain the situation honestly. Most folks around here know about Vance trying to push you out. Might be they'd rather pay you a fair price than see the spring end up in his hands. That we again, casual and natural, as if they'd been partners for years instead of hours. Josephine realized she was staring at Samuel's profile in the gathering darkness and looked away quickly. "All right," she said. "We'll try it. Can't hurt to ask." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, finishing their coffee. The night sounds of the desert rose around them, coyotes calling in the distance, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the occasional hoot of an owl. "I should turn in," Samuel said finally, standing and stretching. "Want to get an early start tomorrow." "Samuel," Josephine said, and he paused. "Thank you. For today, I mean. For stepping in when you didn't have to." He looked down at her, his face shadowed in the dim light from the house. "You stood against 5 armed men with nothing but a rifle and determination. That's not something you see every day. Seemed like the least I could do was even the odds a bit." After he'd gone to the lean-to, Josephine sat alone on the porch for a long time, thinking about the unexpected turns life could take. This morning she'd been alone and desperate. Tonight she had help, a plan, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to save her home. She tried to ignore the small, persistent voice in the back of her mind that whispered Samuel Frost was more than just a hired hand, that the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, and the gentle strength in his calloused hands, were things she noticed far too much for a woman who'd been widowed only 6 months. She pushed those thoughts away firmly. There was no room in her life for such things, not now. Survival came first, everything else could wait. But that night, as she lay in her narrow bed in the adobe house, she found herself thinking not about the confrontation with Vance or the money she owed the bank, but about the sound of Samuel's voice saying "we," as if her problems were his problems now, as if she wasn't alone anymore. The next morning dawned clear and already hot. Josephine was up before sunrise, as was her habit, and was surprised to find Samuel already awake and working. He'd cleaned out the water trough by the barn and was in the process of checking the roof of the lean-to for leaks. "Morning," he called when he saw her. "Found some loose boards up here. Thought I'd fix them before the next rain." "When was the last time it rained?" Josephine asked with a wry smile. "Fair point, but it will eventually, and better to be ready." They worked together through the early morning hours, doing the 100 small tasks that a ranch required. Samuel proved to be as skilled as his weathered hands suggested, competent with tools and animals alike. He reshod Josephine's mare without being asked, fixed the squeaky hinge on the barn door, and patched a gap in the chicken coop fence that had been letting in coyotes. Josephine found herself relaxing into the rhythm of shared work, something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. There was a comfort in having another person there, someone to hand tools to, someone to hold a board steady while you hammered, someone to share the load of water buckets from the well. By mid-morning, they were ready to ride out to talk to the neighbors. Josephine had made a list in her head of the closest homesteads and small ranches that might be interested in water access. The nearest was the Patterson place, about 5 miles south, run by a Norwegian immigrant named Lars Patterson and his wife Ingrid. They rode out under the climbing sun, keeping the horses to an easy walk to conserve their strength in the heat. Samuel rode slightly behind and to the left, a position that spoke of training or instinct for protection. His eyes constantly scanned the landscape, and Josephine realized he was watching for signs of Vance's men. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. "Men like Vance don't give up easy," Samuel said. "Especially when there's money involved. We need to be careful, keep our eyes open." The Patterson ranch was a modest spread with a small herd of cattle and some pigs. Lars Patterson was a big man with sun-bleached hair and a thick accent, but his eyes were shrewd and kind. He listened as Josephine explained her proposal, exchanging glances with his wife. "How much you thinking?" he asked when she finished. $5 a month for unlimited access to the spring for your stock and household needs," Josephine said. She'd agonized over the price with Samuel's help that morning, trying to find something that was fair but would actually help her make her bank payment. Lars stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Vance, he come to me 2 weeks ago, say he going to buy your land, offer me water for $10 a month." "See, that's exactly why I'm doing this," Josephine said. "If he gets the spring, prices will only go up, but if I keep it, I'll keep prices fair." "You have my word." Ingrid spoke up for the first time, her accent even thicker than her husband's. "We know what he tried to do to you, Mrs. Wright. Is not right, a woman alone. We help if we can." Lars nodded slowly. "Okay, $5 a month we pay when you want to start. First payment November 1st, when my bank note is due," Josephine said. "That way you'll have time to gather the cash and I'll have what I need when I need it." They shook hands on the deal, and Lars insisted they stay for lunch. Over a simple meal of bread and cheese, Josephine learned that 3 other families in the area might be interested in similar arrangements. Lars promised to put in a good word for her. As they rode away from the Patterson place, Josephine felt lighter than she had in months. 1 customer secured, potentially 3 more on the way. If she could get even 4 families paying $5 a month, that would be $20, plus whatever sewing and laundry work she could pick up. It would be tight, but it might just be enough. "That went well," Samuel said as they rode. "Better than I hoped," Josephine agreed. "Lars and Ingrid are good people." "Most folks are, given the chance," Samuel said. He paused, then added, "You handled that well. Clear about what you wanted, fair with the price, honest about the situation." Josephine felt herself flush with unexpected pleasure at the compliment. "My father always said honesty was the best business practice. People will pay for reliability and straight dealing." They spent the afternoon visiting 2 more homesteads. The first, run by a widow named Martha Chen, whose husband had been a railroad worker killed in an accident, agreed immediately to the terms. The second, a young couple named David and Sarah Thompson trying to prove up their claim, said they needed to think about it, but seemed interested. By the time they rode back to the ranch, the sun was setting and Josephine's spirits were higher than they'd been since Thomas's death. 3 commitments, 1 maybe, and Lars had mentioned others who might be interested. She was doing the math in her head, calculating and recalculating whether it would be enough. "Don't spend it before you have it," Samuel cautioned gently, as if reading her thoughts. "But it's a good start." That evening they fell into a routine that would become familiar over the coming days. Samuel tended the horses while Josephine prepared supper. They ate together on the porch as the heat of the day faded, talking about the work that needed doing, the state of the fences, whether the old hand pump by the barn could be repaired or needed replacing. It was during one of these conversations that Samuel suddenly went still, his hand moving toward his gun. "What?" Josephine whispered, her own hand reaching for the rifle she now kept propped against the porch railing. "Riders," Samuel said quietly. 2 of them coming from the north." Josephine heard it then, the sound of hoofbeats approaching at a walk. Her stomach tightened. Vance's deadline wasn't until tomorrow noon, but that didn't mean he wouldn't send men early. But as the riders came into view in the fading light, Josephine relaxed slightly. It wasn't Vance's men. It was Sheriff Coleman from town, and with him was a younger man wearing a deputy's badge. Sheriff Coleman was in his 50s, gray-haired and weathered, with a reputation for fairness that was only slightly tarnished by his tendency to look the other way when powerful men like Vance bent the rules. He raised his hand in greeting as they approached. "Evening, Mrs. Wright," he called. "Mind if we step down?" "Evening, Sheriff. Help yourself." Josephine came down from the porch, Samuel a step behind her. The sheriff dismounted, his deputy following suit. Coleman's eyes flicked to Samuel with obvious curiosity. "Samuel Frost," Samuel said, introducing himself. "I'm hired on here." "That's so," Coleman said. "When that happen?" "Yesterday," Josephine said firmly. "Is there a problem, Sheriff?" Coleman shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "Well, Mrs. Wright, I had a visit from Garrett Vance this afternoon. He says you threatened him and his men with a rifle yesterday, said you refused a generous offer for your land. He trespassed on my property with 5 armed men," Josephine said, her voice sharp. "I had every right to defend my land." "Now, I'm not saying you didn't," Coleman said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "But Vance is saying you're not competent to run this place, that you're a danger to yourself and others. He's talking about petitioning the court to have a guardian appointed for your affairs." Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. A guardian. That was even worse than foreclosure. If a judge appointed someone to manage her affairs, she would lose control of everything. And she had no doubt Vance would ensure the guardian was someone in his pocket. "On what grounds?" Samuel asked, his voice hard. Coleman looked at him. "On the grounds that a woman alone can't properly manage a ranch, and that she's becoming irrational and violent in her desperation." "That's ridiculous," Josephine said. "I defended my property from trespassers. How is that irrational?" "I'm just telling you what he's saying," Coleman replied. "Look, Mrs. Wright, I know Vance is a piece of work. But he's got money and connections, and you're 3 months behind on your bank payments. A judge might see his point." "She's not alone anymore," Samuel said. "She's got hired help now. The ranch is being properly managed." Coleman looked skeptical. "No offense, friend, but one drifter doesn't exactly constitute proper management." "I'm not a drifter," Samuel said, his voice taking on an edge. "I'm a rancher who's worked cattle from Wyoming to Colorado. I know how to run an operation, and I can testify to a judge that this place is being managed just fine." "Maybe so," Coleman said. "But Vance is still going to push the issue. I wanted to warn you, Mrs. Wright. He's planning to go to Judge Morrison in El Paso next week. You might want to get yourself a lawyer." "With what money?" Josephine asked bitterly. "I can barely make my bank payment, let alone hire a lawyer." Coleman sighed. "I'm sorry. I wish I could do more, but my hands are tied. Just wanted to give you fair warning." He paused, then added, "For what it's worth, I don't think you're incompetent. I think you're tough as nails, and Vance knows it. But being right doesn't always win the day, especially when money talks." After the sheriff left, Josephine stood in the growing darkness, feeling the weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders. It wasn't enough that Vance wanted her land. Now he was trying to take away her very autonomy, to paint her as some kind of hysteric who couldn't be trusted with her own affairs. "We'll fight it," Samuel said firmly. "How?" "Coleman's right, I don't have money for a lawyer. And even if I did, Judge Morrison is known to be sympathetic to business interests. One woman's word against Garrett Vance's money, I'll lose." "Not if you're not alone," Samuel said. "Not if you have character witnesses, people who'll testify that you're running this place properly. Lars and Ingrid, Martha Chen, the Thompsons if they sign on. We get them all to come to El Paso, tell the judge you're doing fine." "That's asking a lot of people," Josephine said. "It's a day's ride each way, time away from their own work." "People help people they respect," Samuel said. "And you've got respect around here, I can already see that. We ask, explain what's at stake. I think they'll come." Josephine looked at him in the darkness, this man who'd ridden into her life barely 24 hours ago and was already using an hour like he had a stake in her battle. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me. This isn't your fight." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "I told you I lost my place in Colorado. What I didn't tell you was that it was partly because I had no one. When things got bad, I tried to handle everything alone, too proud to ask for help. By the time I realized I needed it, it was too late. Everyone needs help sometimes, Josephine. There's no shame in it, and maybe I'm helping you because I wish someone had helped me." The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability of the admission, cracked something open inside Josephine. She felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "Thank you," she whispered. "We're not beaten yet," Samuel said. "Not by a long shot." Over the next week they worked harder than Josephine had thought possible. Samuel repaired fences, cleared brush, fixed the worst of the damage the ranch had suffered from months of deferred maintenance. Josephine rode out to every homestead and small ranch within 20 miles, explaining her water rights plan and asking for commitments. By the end of the week, she had 7 families signed on at $5 a month each. It wasn't quite enough for the bank payment, but it was close. In the evenings, after the work was done and they'd eaten supper, they would sit on the porch and talk. Samuel told her about growing up in Kansas, the son of a farmer who died young, about learning the cattle business working for big ranches in Wyoming, about building his Colorado place board by board and watching it slip away when the weather turned cruel. Josephine found herself talking too, more than she had to anyone since Thomas died. She told Samuel about meeting Thomas at a church social in San Antonio, about how he'd courted her with wildflowers and terrible poetry, about their dreams of building something lasting in this hard country. She told him about the fever that had taken Thomas, how she'd nursed him for 2 weeks while he burned and shivered, how he'd made her promise not to give up on the ranch. "He knew how much it meant to you," Samuel said. "It was our dream together," Josephine replied. "Giving it up would feel like giving up on him." "He'd be proud of you," Samuel said. "How hard you're fighting." The words settled something inside Josephine, an ache she'd been carrying since Thomas's death. She realized that part of her had been feeling guilty, as if fighting so hard to keep the ranch alone was somehow wrong, as if she should have been more lost in grief to function. But Samuel understood that work and determination could be their own kind of memorial. It was during one of these evening conversations, about 10 days after Samuel had arrived, that he suddenly stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, staring out into the darkness. "What is it?" Josephine asked. "Smell that." Josephine inhaled. Smoke. Not the usual smell of a distant campfire or chimney, but something stronger closer. "The barn," Samuel said, and took off running. Josephine grabbed the water bucket from the porch and followed. As she rounded the corner of the house, she saw flames licking at the southern wall of the barn, still small but growing. Samuel was already there, beating at the flames with a saddle blanket he'd grabbed from somewhere. Josephine threw the water on the fire, but it was barely enough to slow it down. "The well," she gasped. "We need more water." They worked frantically, hauling bucket after bucket from the well, throwing water on the flames. The fire had gotten into the dry wood, and it fought them for every inch. Josephine's arms were burning with exhaustion, her hands blistering from the rope and bucket handles. But she didn't stop. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, they finally got the fire out. The southern wall of the barn was badly charred, and a section of the roof had burned through, but the structure was still standing and the horses were safe. Samuel examined the base of the wall where the fire had started, his face grim. "This was set," he said. "Look here." Someone piled brush against the wall and lit it. Josephine felt cold despite the heat still radiating from the charred wood. "Vance." "Probably," Samuel agreed. "Warning shot, maybe, trying to scare you. It's working," Josephine admitted. Her hands were shaking now that the immediate danger was past. "What's next? The house. What if they come when we're sleeping?" Samuel looked at her seriously. "I won't let that happen. From now on, one of us keeps watch at night. And we report this to Sheriff Coleman, make sure there's a record of it." "Coleman won't do anything. He already said his hands are tied." "Maybe not, but at least it'll be documented. If Vance tries to paint you as irrational, we can point to this and show you had good reason to be defensive." They reported the fire to the sheriff the next morning. Coleman looked at the damage, took some notes, and promised to look into it, which they all knew meant nothing would come of it. But at least it was on record. The near loss of the barn seemed to crystallize something for both of them. They could lose everything in a moment, and there were no guarantees of safety or justice. All they had was each other and their determination to hold on. That night, as Samuel took the first watch and Josephine tried to sleep, she found herself thinking not about the fire or Vance's threats, but about the way Samuel had run toward the danger without hesitation, the way he'd worked beside her until they beat back the flames, the way he'd said "we" and "our," like this ranch and its problems belonged to both of them now. She was starting to realize that somewhere in the midst of all the struggle and work, Samuel had become more than a hired hand. He'd become a partner, someone she relied on and trusted. And if she was honest with herself, he'd become something else too, something she wasn't quite ready to name, but that made her heart beat faster when he smiled at her, and made her notice the way his hair curled at his collar and the strength in his hands. It had only been 2 weeks since he'd ridden onto her land. 2 weeks, and already she couldn't imagine facing any of this without him. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. Thomas had been dead for 6 months. Was it wrong to feel this way about another man so soon? Was she betraying his memory? But another part of her, the part that Thomas had loved for her strength and practicality, pointed out that life continued whether you were ready for it or not, and that loneliness was a slow death of its own. She pushed the thoughts away and tried to sleep, knowing Samuel was out there watching, keeping her safe. The next week brought another complication. A rider came from town with a message that Judge Morrison would be hearing Vance's petition for guardianship in 10 days. Josephine was required to appear in El Paso to contest it. 10 days, she said, staring at the official-looking paper. That's barely enough time to organize anything. That's probably the point, Samuel said. Vance wants to catch you off guard. Well, it's working. But Samuel was already thinking, planning. We get our character witnesses lined up. I'll ride out to the Patterson place, the Chen place, the Thompsons. We explain what's happening, ask them to come to El Paso to testify. Meanwhile, you prepare what you're going to say to the judge. I'm not good at speeches, Josephine said. You don't need a speech. You just need to tell the truth. That you're managing this ranch, meeting your responsibilities, building a legitimate business with the water rights. That you're not alone or helpless. What if the truth isn't enough? Samuel met her eyes. Then we'll deal with whatever comes, but we go down fighting, Josephine. We don't give up before the battle's even joined. His determination was infectious. Josephine nodded, squaring her shoulders. All right, you ride out to the neighbors. I'll start working on what to say to the judge. Samuel did more than just ask the neighbors to testify. He rode all over the region, talking to everyone who'd had dealings with Josephine, gathering statements and building a picture of a woman who was competent, hardworking, and respected in the community. Lars Patterson and his wife agreed immediately to come to El Paso. So did Martha Chen. The Thompsons, who had decided to sign on for the water rights after all, said they would come too. But Samuel didn't stop there. He found the shopkeeper in Terlingua who'd extended Josephine credit and had always been paid back. He talked to the minister who'd presided at Thomas's funeral, who spoke warmly of Josephine's character and faith. He even tracked down the doctor who'd attended Thomas in his final illness, and who could testify that Josephine had nursed her husband with skill and devotion. By the time they were ready to leave for El Paso, Samuel had assembled 8 people willing to testify on Josephine's behalf. It wasn't a lawyer, but it was something. The ride to El Paso took the better part of a day. Josephine and Samuel rode together, meeting the others at a prearranged point along the way. By the time they reached the city in the late afternoon, they were a small caravan, dusty and tired but determined. El Paso was a growing city, full of noise and bustle that felt overwhelming after weeks in the empty desert. They found a boarding house that would take them all, pooling their limited resources to afford the rooms. That evening, they gathered in the small parlor of the boarding house to plan their strategy for the next day. Samuel had been doing research, talking to people in town, learning what he could about Judge Morrison and the legal process. "Morrison's tough but fair from what I hear," Samuel said. "He doesn't like being played, and he doesn't like people who try to use the law to settle personal scores. Our best bet is to be straightforward. Don't try to be clever, just present the facts." "What facts?" Josephine asked. "That I'm barely holding on by my fingernails." "That doesn't exactly scream competent management." "The fact that you're holding on at all is what matters," Lars said, his accent thick but his point clear. "Many men, they would have given up already. You fight, you plan, you work. This is not incompetent." The others murmured agreement, and Josephine felt a swell of gratitude for these people who'd taken time from their own lives to support her. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock the next morning at the courthouse. They arrived early, a show of respect for the court and also to claim the best seats. Vance was already there, dressed in an expensive suit and surrounded by 2 men in similar attire who had to be his lawyers. Judge Morrison was a lean man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He looked over the crowded courtroom with evident surprise, probably not expecting this kind of turnout for what he'd thought would be a routine guardianship hearing. Vance's lawyer went first, laying out the case. "Mrs. Josephine Wright was a widow, alone and struggling, 3 months behind on her mortgage, barely scraping by. She'd threatened peaceful visitors with a rifle, refused reasonable offers for her land, and showed signs of emotional instability brought on by grief and isolation. For her own good and the good of the community, she needed a guardian to manage her affairs. The lawyer was smooth, painting a picture of a poor widow who'd been overwhelmed by circumstances and needed protection, even from herself. Josephine felt her cheeks burn with anger and humiliation as he spoke. Then it was her turn. She stood, hands clasped tight to keep them from shaking, and faced the judge. "Your Honor," she began, and was relieved to hear her voice come out steady. "Everything Mr. Vance's lawyer said is partially true. I am a widow. I am behind on my mortgage. I did threaten trespassers with a rifle, but he left out the most important parts. I'm behind on my mortgage because my husband died suddenly, and it took me time to figure out how to keep the ranch running. I threatened trespassers because Mr. Vance has been trying to force me off my land so he can take the water rights that make it valuable. And I'm not alone anymore. I have help now, and I have a plan to make my mortgage payments." She gestured to Samuel, standing in the front row. "This is Samuel Frost. He's an experienced rancher who's working with me to run the ranch properly. And these are my neighbors." She indicated the others. They're all willing to testify that I'm competent and working hard to meet my obligations. Judge Morrison looked interested. Tell me about this plan, Mrs. Wright. Josephine explained the water rights arrangement, how she was providing access to her spring for reasonable fees, creating a sustainable income stream that would let her make her mortgage payments while keeping prices fair for her neighbors. That sounds like sound business practice, Morrison said. Innovative even. He looked at Vance's lawyer. Does your client dispute any of this? The lawyer looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, the question is whether Mrs. Wright is competent to manage these affairs alone. But she's not alone, Morrison said. She has hired help and the support of her community. Let's hear from some of these witnesses. Lars Patterson testified first, his accent thick but his words clear. He spoke about Josephine's fairness in setting the water prices, her hard work, her determination. Martha Chen testified about Josephine's kindness in not charging her full price when she'd been short on money 1 month. The shopkeeper testified about Josephine always honoring her debts. The minister spoke about her faith and character. Finally, Samuel took the stand. The judge studied him carefully. You're the hired man, Mr. Frost. Yes, sir. How long have you worked for Mrs. Wright? 3 weeks, Your Honor. Morrison raised an eyebrow. That's not very long. What makes you qualified to assess her competency? I've worked ranches all over the West for 12 years, Your Honor. I know good management when I see it. Mrs. Wright knows her land, knows her resources, and has a solid plan for making the ranch profitable. She's one of the toughest, most capable people I've ever worked for. But she needed to hire you, Vance's lawyer interjected. Doesn't that prove she can't manage alone? It proves she's smart enough to know when she needs help, Samuel shot back. That's not weakness, it's good judgment. Every successful ranch operation has multiple hands. No one runs a place completely alone unless they want to fail. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. Good point. He looked at Vance, who'd been sitting stone-faced through all the testimony. Mr. Vance, you're the petitioner here. What exactly is your interest in Mrs. Wright's affairs? Vance stood, smooth and confident. Only her welfare, Your Honor. I've made Mrs. Wright several generous offers for her land, thinking to spare her the hardship of trying to maintain it. My concern is purely humanitarian. Is it? Morrison said dryly. It wouldn't have anything to do with the water rights on her property, would it? The water rights are valuable, certainly, Vance conceded, but that's not my primary concern. No. Your primary concern is buying the land cheap when the bank forecloses, Morrison said bluntly. Mr. Vance, I've been a judge for 20 years. I know the difference between humanitarian concern and business maneuvering. This court is not going to be used as a tool to help you acquire property at below market prices. Vance's face reddened. Your Honor, I object to that characterization. Object all you want, Morrison said. Mrs. Wright, when is your next mortgage payment due? November 1st, Your Honor, Josephine said. 6 weeks from now. And do you have the money? Josephine hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. Not yet, Your Honor, but with the water rights income and some other work I should be able to make it. Morrison nodded. Here's what I'm going to do. Mrs. Wright, I'm denying Mr. Vance's petition for guardianship. I see no evidence that you're incompetent or need anyone to manage your affairs. However, I'm also aware that your financial situation is precarious. I'm going to send a letter to the bank in El Paso informing them of this hearing and my findings, and recommending they give you a 3-month extension on your mortgage given your demonstrated good faith efforts to meet your obligations. That should give you enough time to get this water rights business established and start generating steady income. Josephine felt her knees go weak with relief. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet, Morrison said. You've still got a lot of work ahead of you, but I believe you can do it. This court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, their small group erupted in celebration. Lars clapped Samuel on the back hard enough to make him stagger. Martha Chen hugged Josephine, tears in her eyes. Even the minister, a normally reserved man, was grinning broadly. "You did it," Samuel said to Josephine, his gray eyes warm. "You stood up to Vance and won." "We did it," Josephine corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without all of you." But when her eyes met Samuel's, something passed between them that had nothing to do with courtrooms and everything to do with the connection that had been growing between them over the past 3 weeks. His smile faded into something more serious, more intent, and Josephine felt her breath catch. Lars broke the moment by announcing they should all have dinner to celebrate. They found a restaurant that could accommodate their group and spent the evening eating well and trading stories. Josephine couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this light, this hopeful. She found herself sitting next to Samuel, acutely aware of how close he was, how their hands occasionally brushed on the table. When he leaned over to quietly ask if she was all right, his breath warm against her ear, she had to suppress a shiver that had nothing to do with cold. It was late when they finally returned to the boarding house. The others went to their rooms, but Josephine and Samuel lingered in the small parlor, neither quite ready for the day to end. "Thank you," Josephine said, "for everything you did, organizing the witnesses, testifying, all of it." "I wouldn't have won without you. You'd have found a way," Samuel said. "You always do. I'm not so sure about that." She paused, then added softly, "I was drowning before you came, Samuel. I just didn't want to admit it." He moved closer, and suddenly the space between them felt charged, electric. "Josephine, I need to tell you something." Her heart started beating faster. "What?" "When I rode onto your land 3 weeks ago, I was looking for work, that's true, but I was also looking for something else. A reason to stop drifting, I guess, a place to matter." He paused, searching for words. "I found more than I expected. I found someone worth fighting for." Josephine's breath caught. "Samuel, I know it's only been 3 weeks," he continued. "I know you were widowed just 6 months ago. I'm not asking for anything, not trying to rush you. I just need you to know that what I feel for you isn't about the ranch or the work. It's about you. Your strength, your determination, the way you face down men with guns and never back down. I admire you, Josephine. More than admire you, if I'm being honest." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. "I feel it too," she whispered, "and I've been feeling guilty about it, like I'm betraying Thomas's memory." Samuel reached out and gently took her hand. "Life doesn't stop because someone dies. Thomas wouldn't want you to be alone forever, would he?" "No," Josephine admitted. "He always said I was too stubborn to be alone for long, that I'd drive any partner crazy with my need to do things my way." Samuel smiled. "Well, I've survived 3 weeks. That's got to count for something." Josephine laughed through her tears. "It counts for a lot." She squeezed his hand, marveling at how right it felt to touch him. "But I'm not ready yet, Samuel, not for anything serious. I need time." "I know," he said, "and I'll wait, however long it takes." They stood there in the dim parlor, hands clasped, both knowing something had shifted between them, but content to let it unfold at its own pace. The ride back to the ranch the next day felt different. Lighter somehow, as if winning in court had lifted a weight they'd been carrying. The others peeled off along the way, each heading to their own homesteads with promises to stay in touch and support each other. By the time Samuel and Josephine reached the ranch, it was late afternoon. The place looked the same as when they'd left it, but somehow it felt different to Josephine. It felt like home in a way it hadn't since Thomas died. Maybe because now she was sharing it with someone again, even if just as partners and friends. They fell back into their routines, but with an ease and comfort that hadn't been there before. The work continued, always more to do than hours in the day, but they did it together. Samuel repaired the burned section of the barn, rebuilding it stronger than before. Josephine spent hours at her sewing, taking on work from town to bring in extra cash. The water rights business started generating steady income. More families signed on, word spreading that Josephine charged fair prices and kept the spring clean and accessible. By October, she had 12 families paying for access, bringing in $60 a month. Combined with her sewing income, and the small amount Samuel could now draw as wages, she was going to make her mortgage payment with room to spare. October in West Texas was beautiful, the worst of the summer heat fading into warm days and cool nights. The desert came alive in subtle ways, wildflowers blooming where rain had fallen, animals emerging from summer torpor. Josephine found herself noticing these things again, taking pleasure in small beauties she'd been too exhausted and worried to see before. She also found herself noticing Samuel in ways she hadn't let herself before. The way he moved with easy confidence around the ranch, the sound of his laughter when something amused him, the gentleness in his hands when he worked with the horses. The way he looked at her sometimes, with warmth and something deeper that made her heart skip. They hadn't spoken again about feelings or the future, but it was there between them, growing stronger each day. Sometimes their hands would brush passing tools or reaching for the same item, and the touch would linger just a moment longer than necessary. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression that made her blush and look away. Sometimes in the evening, sitting on the porch, their chairs would drift closer together until their shoulders almost touched. It was approaching 3 months since Samuel had arrived when Garrett Vance made his final play. They were working in the barn on a sunny October morning when Samuel suddenly straightened, listening. "Riders," he said. "A lot of them." Josephine grabbed her rifle and they stepped outside. A group of at least a dozen men was approaching, all armed with Vance at the front. But there was someone else with them this time, a man in a suit carrying a leather satchel. "Mrs. Wright," Vance called out as they drew near, "I have some business to discuss." "Then you can discuss it from off my land," Josephine said, raising the rifle. The man in the suit spoke up. "Mrs. Wright, my name is Harold Pemberton. I'm a representative of the El Paso Bank and Trust. May I approach?" Josephine and Samuel exchanged glances. "Come ahead," she said reluctantly. "But just you. The rest stay where they are." Pemberton dismounted and walked forward, opening his satchel. He pulled out an official-looking document. "Mrs. Wright, I regret to inform you that your mortgage payments are in arrears. The bank has decided to exercise its right to foreclose on your property." Josephine felt the ground tilt under her feet. "That's not possible." "Judge Morrison sent a letter recommending an extension. My next payment isn't due until November 1st, and I'll have the money." "The bank received Judge Morrison's letter," Pemberton said. "However, a more detailed review of your account revealed that you also missed a payment in March, shortly after your husband's death. The bank gave you a grace period at that time, but the missed payment was never made up. When combined with the subsequent missed payments, you're now more than 4 months in arrears, which triggers the acceleration clause in your mortgage agreement. The full balance is due immediately." Josephine's mind raced. March. Yes, she'd been so overwhelmed with grief and confusion in the weeks after Thomas's death that she'd missed the March payment. The bank had said they would work with her, that she could make it up later. She'd been focused on staying current with subsequent payments, but she'd never had enough extra to catch up on that one missed payment. "How much?" she asked, her voice hollow. "The remaining balance is $847, Pemberton said. "Due immediately, or the property reverts to the bank." $800. It might as well be 8,000. She had nowhere near that kind of money. This is Vance's doing, Samuel said angrily. He got to the bank, told them to call the note. Pemberton looked uncomfortable. Mr. Vance has expressed interest in purchasing the property from the bank once foreclosure is complete. But the decision to foreclose was made by the bank's board based on the account status. I'll bet it was, Samuel muttered. Josephine felt numb. After everything, all the fighting, the testimony, the judge's ruling, it was ending like this. Because of one missed payment she'd been too grief-stricken to remember. "How long do I have?" she asked quietly. "The foreclosure is effective immediately," Pemberton said. "However, the bank will give you 1 week to gather your personal belongings and vacate the property. After that, we'll take possession and proceed with sale." Vance rode forward then, a triumphant smile on his face. "Mrs. Wright, I'd be willing to lease you a small house in town, help you get established there. No hard feelings, just business." Josephine looked at him with all the contempt she felt. "Go to hell, Vance." His smile faded. "Suit yourself. You've got 1 week." He turned his horse and rode off, taking his men with him. Pemberton followed, leaving Samuel and Josephine standing alone in the yard. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Josephine walked slowly to the porch and sat down heavily, the rifle loose in her hands. "There has to be something we can do," Samuel said. "Some way to fight this." "We can't fight $800, Josephine said dully. "That's more money than most people see in 2 years out here." "What about the water rights income? We could ask for advances, explain the situation." "Even if everyone gave me a year's worth of payments in advance, that would only be $720. And I can't ask people to do that, Samuel. It would be taking food out of their families' mouths." Samuel paced, frustration evident in every line of his body. "There has to be something. Land this valuable, there has to be someone who'd give you a loan against it." "Who?" "The only bank in 100 miles is the one foreclosing. And even if there were another lender, why would they loan me money when I've already defaulted once?" Samuel had no answer to that. He sat down beside her on the porch, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I'm so sorry, Josephine." She leaned against him, too tired and defeated to care about propriety. "It's not your fault. None of this is your fault." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "These past 3 months with you, they've been good. Better than good. I want you to know that. Even if this is how it ends, I'm grateful for the time we had." "This isn't the end," Samuel said fiercely. "I won't let it be." But even his determination couldn't change the reality of $800 they didn't have. Over the next 2 days, they worked in a haze of grief and anger. Josephine started packing her few belongings, each item a reminder of the life she was losing. Samuel continued the ranch work with grim determination, as if keeping busy could somehow change the outcome. On the 3rd day, Lars Patterson and his wife arrived, having heard the news. They brought Martha Chen with them. "We take up collection," Lars announced without preamble. "From everyone who used the water, from people in town, from church. We raise $150 so far." Josephine felt tears spring to her eyes. "I can't take your money. That's your savings, your family's security." "Is gift," Ingrid said firmly. "You give us fair price for water when you could charge more. You are good neighbor. We help." $150 still leaves me 700 short, Josephine said. "It's not enough." "Is start," Lars insisted. "We keep trying, maybe we find more." They were arguing about it when another rider appeared. It was the young deputy who'd accompanied Sheriff Coleman before. He dismounted and handed Josephine an envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "Don't know, madam. Sheriff said to bring it to you right away." Josephine opened the envelope and pulled out a bank draft. Her hands started shaking as she read the amount, $500. What is it? Samuel asked. Wordlessly, Josephine handed him the draft. There was a note with it, written in careful script. Mrs. Wright, Josephine read aloud, I heard about your situation. The law may not have been on your side this time, but justice should be. This money is a gift, no strings attached. Use it to save your home. Judge Morrison. $500, Samuel said in disbelief. The judge gave you $500. With Lars's $150, that's $650, Josephine said, her mind working frantically. I still need $200 more, but this is close. This is so close. We sell, Lars said suddenly. Ingrid and me, we have some cattle, some equipment we can sell. Maybe raise $50, $75. I can sell my mother's jewelry, Martha Chen offered. It's not much, but maybe $20. No, Josephine said. I can't let you all sacrifice so much. Is not sacrifice, Lars said. Is investment. You lose land, we all pay more for water under Vance. Better we help you keep land, keep fair prices. Josephine looked at Samuel helplessly, overwhelmed by the generosity being offered. He squeezed her hand. Let them help, he said quietly. You've been there for them. Let them be there for you. Over the next 3 days, money came from unexpected places. The minister organized a special collection at church. The shopkeeper who'd testified on Josephine's behalf contributed $50 and forgave her outstanding credit balance. A cattle buyer passing through town, who'd heard the story and remembered dealing fairly with Thomas years ago, gave $20. The Thompsons sold a wagon and contributed $30. Samuel disappeared for a full day and came back with $150. When Josephine asked where he'd gotten it, he just said he'd sold some things he'd been holding on to. Only later did she notice his father's pocket watch was gone, along with a silver chased saddle he'd been so careful with. He'd sold his only valuable possessions to help save her land. By the morning of the 6th day, they had $830. They were $17 short. Josephine sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of money and bank drafts. So close. After everything, they were $17 short of saving her home. Samuel came in from the barn and saw her sitting there. We'll find it, he said. We've got one more day. Where? Josephine asked. We've asked everyone, sold everything. There's nowhere left to turn. Samuel sat down across from her. He was quiet for a long time, then said, There is one place. Where? Me, he said. I have $17. It's all I have left in the world, but it's exactly what you need. Josephine stared at him. Samuel, I can't take your last money. Why not? You've taken everyone else's help. That's different. They're my neighbors, my community, you're. She trailed off, not sure how to finish. I'm what? Samuel asked gently. You're more than that, Josephine said quietly. You're my partner, my friend, maybe more than a friend. Taking your last dollars, leaving you with nothing, that's not right. Josephine, look at me, Samuel said. When she met his eyes, he continued, I told you before I was looking for a place to matter when I rode onto your land. I found it here with you. This ranch, this life we're building together, it matters more to me than any amount of money. If $17 saves it, then that's $17 well spent. But what will you do? How will you get by? Samuel smiled. Same way I got by before. Work for wages, save up slowly. Besides, I'm not going anywhere. You still need a hired hand, don't you? I need you, Josephine said, and realized as she said it how true it was. Not just for the work, not just as a partner in fighting for the ranch, but as someone she'd come to care for deeply. I need you, Samuel. He reached across the table and took both her hands. Then take the $17 and save our home. Our home, Samuel confirmed. If you'll have me as more than just hired help, as a true partner in this place. Josephine felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll have you." Samuel stood, pulling her up with him, and then his arms were around her and she was holding him tight, crying against his chest. He stroked her hair gently, murmuring reassurances. When she finally pulled back, he cupped her face in his hands. "May I kiss you?" he asked. In answer, Josephine rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened into something more passionate. She could feel his heart beating against hers, could taste salt from her tears, could feel the strength of his hands holding her close. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Josephine Wright," he said. "I think I have since the day I rode up and saw you standing there with a rifle, too stubborn to back down." "I love you too," Josephine whispered. "Even though I didn't want to, even though I felt guilty about it. I love you, Samuel Frost." They stood there holding each other, the morning sun streaming through the kitchen window, until finally Josephine said, "We should get the money to the bank." They rode to El Paso together, carrying the carefully counted $847. Pemberton met them at the bank, clearly surprised to see them. "Mrs. Wright," he said, "I didn't expect to see you until the eviction date." "We're here to pay the mortgage," Josephine said, and placed the money on his desk. $847, the full amount due. Pemberton's eyebrows rose. He carefully counted the money, then counted it again. Finally, he looked up. "This is correct," he said. He sounded almost disappointed. "Where did you get this?" "From people who believe in justice and fairness," Josephine said. "From neighbors and friends who won't let a bully like Garrett Vance steal someone's land through legal tricks." Pemberton had the grace to look embarrassed. "Yes, well, the debt is paid in full. I'll prepare the paperwork showing the account is current." He paused, then added, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Wright, I'm glad you were able to save your land. Not everyone at the bank agreed with the decision to foreclose." "But you followed orders anyway," Samuel said, his voice hard. "I did my job," Pemberton replied, "but I won't lie and say I'm not relieved this is the outcome." They left the bank with the receipt showing the mortgage was current and rode straight to Vance's office. He looked up in surprise when they entered, then his face darkened as he saw the receipt Josephine placed on his desk. "The mortgage is paid," she said. "In full. You don't get my land, Vance. Not now, not ever." Vance's jaw tightened. "Where did you get that kind of money?" "That's none of your concern," Josephine said. "But you should know that this community stands together. You tried to divide us to take advantage of a widow you thought was helpless. You were wrong." "This isn't over," Vance said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "Yes, it is," Samuel said. "You've lost, Vance. Accept it and move on. Because if you try anything else against Mrs. Wright or her property, you'll have to answer not just to her, but to everyone in this community. And you've already seen we don't back down easy." They left Vance fuming behind his desk and rode back to the ranch in the gathering twilight. When they arrived, Josephine dismounted and looked around at the small adobe house, the patched barn, the dusty acres that had cost her so much to keep. "It's not much," she said. "It's everything," Samuel replied. He came to stand beside her, taking her hand. "It's home." That night, after they'd celebrated their victory with a simple dinner and coffee, they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. "What happens now?" Josephine asked. "Now we keep working," Samuel said. "Build up the herd, improve the property, make the water rights business even more successful. Save up so you're never this close to losing everything again." "I meant with us," Josephine said softly. Samuel turned to look at her. "What do you want to happen with us?" Josephine thought about it, about Thomas and the guilt she'd carried, about the loneliness of the past 6 months, about the way Samuel had become essential to her life in such a short time. "I want you to stay," she said. Not just as hired help, but as a true partner. I want us to build this ranch together, to make decisions together, to share everything equally." "That sounds like a marriage proposal," Samuel said, a smile in his voice. "Maybe it is," Josephine said. "Though I suppose it's not proper for a woman to propose. Nothing about our situation has been proper," Samuel pointed out. "Why start now?" Josephine laughed. "Fair point." She turned to face him fully. "Samuel Frost, will you marry me?" "Yes," Samuel said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, Josephine Wright, but on one condition." "What's that?" "That we wait at least a few months," Samuel said. "Not because I don't want to marry you right now, but because I want to do this right. I want time to court you properly, to build a life together first. I don't want people saying we got married just for practical reasons, or because it was convenient." Josephine felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "You want to court me?" "I do. I want to take you to dances in town, walk with you by the spring, bring you wildflowers and terrible poetry like Thomas did. I want you to be absolutely certain this is what you want before we make it permanent." "I'm already certain," Josephine said. "Then a few months won't hurt," Samuel replied. "Besides, it'll give us time to really build up the ranch, to make sure we're partners in truth before we're partners in law." They settled on a spring wedding, giving them 6 months to prepare. It was simultaneously forever and no time at all. Over the winter months, the ranch began to truly thrive. With the mortgage current and the immediate threats resolved, they could focus on building rather than just surviving. Samuel used his experience to start a small cattle operation, buying a few head of breeding stock with their pooled savings. Josephine expanded the water rights business, working out deals with some of the larger ranchers in the region. Samuel did court her, just as he'd promised. On Sundays, they would ride out to the spring and have picnics. He brought her flowers he'd picked from the desert, tough little blooms that survived in harsh conditions, like she did. He wrote her poems that were indeed terrible but made her laugh. They danced at the barn raisings and church socials, and people started to see them not as a widow and her hired hand but as partners, as a couple. Samuel moved from the lean-to into the barn that winter, a small step but one that kept things proper while acknowledging their changing relationship. They still worked side by side every day, but now there were stolen kisses by the barn, held hands walking back from checking the fences, long conversations that stretched into the night. In February, Samuel formally proposed, getting down on one knee in front of the whole congregation after Sunday services, and asking Josephine to marry him with a ring he'd saved up for 3 months to buy. It was a simple gold band, no fancy stones, but Josephine cried when he slipped it on her finger. The wedding was set for April 15th, a date chosen because it was after the spring work, but before the brutal summer heat set in. The whole community turned out to help prepare. Ingrid and Martha made Josephine's dress, a simple but beautiful creation in cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Lars and the other men helped Samuel add a room onto the adobe house, a proper bedroom for the married couple. Judge Morrison came from El Paso for the ceremony, insisting he wouldn't miss it for the world. Sheriff Coleman attended too, bringing his wife and making awkward small talk with Samuel about how he'd known they'd work things out. Even some of the bigger ranchers came, men who'd been convinced by Josephine's fair dealing on water rights that she was someone worth knowing. Garrett Vance didn't attend, of course, but his absence was noted and quietly celebrated. He tried twice more to make trouble after his failed foreclosure attempt, once by challenging the water rights in court, and once by trying to buy out some of the families who paid Josephine for access. Both attempts had failed. The community that had come together to save Josephine's ranch stayed together, and eventually Vance had given up and moved his operations elsewhere. On her wedding day, Josephine stood in the small adobe house that had almost been taken from her, wearing her new dress and her mother's pearls, and felt overwhelmingly grateful for everything she'd fought for and everyone who'd fought with her. Martha Chen came to tell her it was time. "You look beautiful," Martha said. "Thomas would be happy for you, you know. He'd want you to have this." "I know," Josephine said, and realized it was true. Thomas had loved her too much to want her to be alone forever. He'd have liked Samuel, would have respected him. The ceremony was held outside under the cottonwood trees by the spring, the place that had been worth fighting for. The minister kept it short and sweet, knowing his audience preferred action to words. Samuel stood waiting at the front, wearing a new shirt and vest, his hair freshly cut but already curling rebelliously at his collar. When Josephine walked toward him down the makeshift aisle, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart soar. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but Josephine barely heard the traditional words. She was too focused on Samuel's face, on the way he held her hands like they were precious, on the way his voice shook slightly when he said his vows. "I, Samuel Frost, take you, Josephine Wright, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to stand beside you in all things, to work with you and support you, to never let you face the world alone. I promise to load your rifle when enemies come, to share your burdens, and to love you for all my days." The reference to their first meeting, to the words he'd spoken when he rode up and saw her holding her last acre with a rifle, made several people in the crowd murmur appreciatively. It made Josephine's eyes fill with tears. "I, Josephine Wright, take you, Samuel Frost, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she said, her voice clear despite the tears. "I promise to share with you everything I have and everything I am. I promise to trust you, to work beside you, to build a life and a home together. I promise to never give up on us or on the dreams we share, and to love you for all my days." When the minister pronounced them married and Samuel kissed her, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Someone fired a gun in the air in celebration, the sharp crack echoing across the desert. The reception was held at the ranch, tables set up in the yard, food contributed by dozens of families. There was dancing to fiddle music, toasts with whiskey and coffee, speeches that made everyone laugh and cry. Lars Patterson gave a rambling toast about stubborn women and smart men. Judge Morrison toasted to justice and love, not necessarily in that order. Martha Chen just raised her glass and said, "To new beginnings," which summed it up perfectly. As the sun set and the party continued, Samuel pulled Josephine away from the crowd, leading her to the porch of the house. Their house now, legally and truly. "Happy?" he asked. "So happy," Josephine said, leaning against him. "Sometimes I think about how close I came to losing all of this. Not just the land, but the chance for this life, this love, if you hadn't ridden up that day." "But I did," Samuel said. "I rode up and saw the most stubborn, brave woman I'd ever met, holding onto her land with nothing but a rifle and determination. How could I not fall in love?" "When did you know?" Josephine asked. "When did you know you loved me?" Samuel thought about it. "That first day when you took me at my word and trusted me enough to hire me, even though you had no reason to. When I saw that, despite everything you'd been through, you could still take a leap of faith. That's when I started falling. What about you? When you said we," Josephine admitted. "When you started talking about our problems and our plans instead of just mine. When I realized I wasn't alone anymore, that's when I knew." They stood together, watching their friends and neighbors celebrate, watching the life they'd fought for continue around them. The party went on until late, people reluctant to leave such a joyful gathering. Eventually, though, the last guests departed, calling out final congratulations. Lars and Ingrid were the last to go, Ingrid hugging Josephine tight and whispering, "Be happy, my friend." Finally, Samuel and Josephine were alone. They walked hand in hand into the house, into the new bedroom that their friends had helped build, and closed the door on the world outside. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Josephine's life. The ranch continued to prosper under their joint management. Samuel's instincts for cattle and Josephine's business sense with the water rights combined to create a successful operation that, while never wealthy, was comfortable and secure. They added more cattle, improved the fences, planted a small vegetable garden near the spring where the soil held moisture. Samuel built a proper chicken coop, and Josephine started keeping bees, harvesting honey that she sold in town. They were building something lasting, something meaningful. But more than the material success, it was the partnership itself that made Josephine happy. Making decisions together, sharing the work and the rewards, having someone to talk to at the end of long days. The companionship and love that grew deeper with each passing season. By the fall of 1879, a year and a half after Samuel had first ridden onto her land, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and a little bit of fear. Childbirth was dangerous on the frontier, and they both knew it. But Martha Chen, who'd been trained as a midwife in her youth, promised to attend the birth. Ingrid Patterson, mother of 4 healthy children, offered her advice and experience. The community that had saved Josephine's land now rallied around her pregnancy, making sure she had what she needed. Samuel was alternately overjoyed and terrified. He fussed over Josephine constantly, insisting she not work too hard, trying to take on more of the physical labor himself. She finally had to sit him down and explain that she was pregnant, not dying, and needed to stay active and busy. Their son was born in March of 1880, an early spring that brought wildflowers blooming across the desert. The labor was long but not complicated, and when Martha finally placed the squalling infant in Josephine's arms, she felt a love so overwhelming it took her breath away. "He's perfect," Samuel said, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. "You're both perfect." They named him Thomas Samuel Frost, honoring both the husband Josephine had loved and lost and the husband who'd saved her and loved her now. It felt right to Josephine, a way of acknowledging that her life was a continuous story, not separate chapters. Little Thomas thrived, a healthy baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. The ranch house filled with the sounds of crying and cooing, and Josephine learned to balance motherhood with ranch work, doing chores with a baby wrapped against her chest. Samuel proved to be a devoted father, patient and gentle with their son. Josephine would often find him in the rocking chair he'd made, baby Thomas asleep on his chest, both of them peaceful and content. 2 years later, their daughter was born, a girl they named Mary after Samuel's mother. She was a quieter baby than Thomas had been, with dark hair and solemn eyes that seemed to take in everything. Life settled into a pattern that was busy but fulfilling. The children grew, learning to walk and talk. The ranch continued to prosper, and they were able to buy adjacent land when it became available, expanding their holdings. The water rights business remained strong, and Josephine became known throughout the region as a fair dealer and skilled negotiator. Samuel proved to be everything he'd promised that first day when he'd ridden up and offered to help. He was a partner in every sense, sharing the work, the decisions, and the rewards. He was a loving husband who still brought her wildflowers and terrible poetry, who still kissed her like she was precious, who still said we and our as naturally as breathing. By 1885, 7 years after Samuel had first arrived, The Wright Frost Ranch was one of the most respected operations in the region. Not the biggest or the wealthiest, but known for honest dealing, quality livestock, and fair treatment of neighbors and employees. They'd hired 2 additional hands to help with the work, good men who were treated fairly, and became part of the extended ranch family. Little Thomas was 5 now, already fascinated by cattle and horses, tagging along after his father whenever allowed. Mary was 3, quieter but equally determined, with a particular talent for gentling even the most skittish horses. Sometimes, Josephine would stand on the porch in the evening, watching Samuel teach Thomas how to rope a fence post while Mary played nearby, and feel overwhelmed by how much her life had changed. 7 years ago, she'd been alone and desperate, holding her last acre with a rifle, certain she was going to lose everything. Now she had a thriving ranch, 2 beautiful children, a husband she loved more with each passing year, and a community that had proven family wasn't just blood but also choice and loyalty. Garrett Vance had faded from their lives, his schemes forgotten. The last Josephine had heard, he'd moved to Arizona Territory, chasing some new opportunity. She found she didn't care what happened to him anymore. He was part of the past, a threat overcome and dismissed. One evening in late summer, after the children were in bed, Samuel found Josephine on the porch, gazing out at the land she'd fought so hard to keep. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "Just thinking about how different things are from 7 years ago," Josephine said. "How scared I was, how alone, how certain I was going to lose everything." "But you didn't," Samuel said. "You held on." "We held on," Josephine corrected. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You'd have found a way," Samuel said. "You're too stubborn to give up." "Maybe," Josephine said, "but I'm glad I didn't have to do it alone." She reached over and took his hand. "Thank you, Samuel, for riding up that day, for offering to load my rifle, for staying. Thank you for all of it." Samuel squeezed her hand. "Best decision I ever made," he said. "Seeing you standing there with that Winchester, eyes blazing, refusing to back down, I knew I'd found something special. I just didn't know yet how much you'd come to mean to me." "I love you," Josephine said simply. "I love you too," Samuel replied. "Now and always." They sat together in the gathering darkness, hands clasped, watching the stars emerge over the desert they'd made their home. In the distance, cattle lowed peacefully. From inside the house came the soft sound of children breathing in sleep. The spring that had been worth fighting for murmured to itself under the cottonwood trees. This was the life they'd built together, acre by acre, fence post by fence post, difficult decision by difficult decision. It wasn't perfect, wasn't easy, but it was theirs, earned through determination and love and the simple refusal to give up. Josephine thought about the woman she'd been that September morning in 1878, desperate and alone, and wished she could go back and tell her younger self that it would be okay. That help would come in the form of a gray-eyed cowboy on a roan horse. That love could be found again, even in grief. That community and partnership and family could save you when you thought you were too far gone to save. But mostly she was grateful she couldn't go back, because it meant she got to stay here in this moment with this man, living this life they'd created together. "What are you smiling about?" Samuel asked, noticing her expression. "Everything," Josephine said. "Absolutely everything." As the years continued to roll forward, the ranch became more than just a place. It became a legacy. Little Thomas grew into a young man with his father's quiet strength and his mother's determination. He took to ranch work naturally, learning everything Samuel could teach him about cattle and land management. Mary proved to have her mother's head for business, helping Josephine manage the water rights contracts and handle the financial side of the operation. She also had a gift for breeding horses, developing a small but respected operation that sold quality mounts throughout the region. In 1892, when Thomas the Younger was 17, he married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, a capable young woman named Elizabeth who fit right into the family. They built a small house on the eastern edge of the property, near the spring, and started their own family a year later. Mary, always more independent, shocked everyone by announcing at 19 that she wanted to become a teacher. She went to San Antonio for training and returned to Terlingua to establish the first proper school in the area, teaching children from all the surrounding ranches and homesteads. She married at 24, a quiet scholar who'd come to Terlingua to write about frontier life, and ended up falling in love with the schoolteacher who could ride and rope as well as she could teach. Samuel and Josephine watched their children grow and make their own lives with pride and joy. They grew older together, Samuel's hair going gray and then white, Josephine developing the sun-weathered face of a woman who'd spent her life outdoors. But the love between them never diminished. If anything, it deepened, seasoned by shared experiences and triumphs and sorrows. They faced challenges, of course. A drought year in 1893 that tested their resources. A harsh winter in 1895 that killed some cattle. The usual ups and downs of frontier life. But they faced everything together, the way they always had. Lars and Ingrid Patterson remained close friends until Lars passed away peacefully in 1896. Samuel and Josephine attended the funeral, mourning the man who'd been one of their first supporters. Ingrid moved in with one of her daughters but remained a regular visitor to the ranch. Martha Chen lived to the impressive age of 78, still attending births and sharing her wisdom until shortly before her death in 1898. Her funeral was attended by what seemed like half the region, all the people whose lives she'd touched. Judge Morrison retired in 1894 but kept in touch with Josephine and Samuel, visiting when he could. His quiet support and unexpected gift had turned the tide at a crucial moment, and they never forgot it. By 1900, Samuel and Josephine were in their late 40s, still active and engaged with the ranch, but increasingly willing to let the younger generation take on more responsibility. They had 5 grandchildren by then, with another on the way, and the ranch house was often filled with the sounds of children playing and learning about the land that had been fought for so hard. One evening in the spring of 1900, 22 years after Samuel had first ridden onto Josephine's land, they sat on the porch as they had thousands of times before. The porch had been rebuilt and expanded over the years, but it was still their favorite place, the spot where they'd first shared coffee and started building their partnership. "You ever regret it?" Josephine asked. "Everything you gave up to help me save this place. Your father's watch, all your savings, your last $17. Samuel looked at her in genuine surprise. "Regret it? Josephine, helping you save this ranch meant I got to be part of building it. I got you, our children, our grandchildren, a life with meaning and purpose. I got everything I'd been looking for when I left Colorado. How could I possibly regret that? I just want you to know," Josephine said, "that I never took it for granted, any of it. You rode into my life when I needed help most, and you stayed and you loved me and you built this with me. I am so grateful, Samuel, for all of it." "The gratitude goes both ways," Samuel said. "You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You taught me that asking for help isn't weakness and that partnership is stronger than going it alone. You showed me what real strength looks like, standing on that porch with a rifle, refusing to be moved." Josephine laughed. "I was terrified that day." "Maybe," Samuel said, "but you didn't show it. You held your ground." He paused, then added with a smile, though I'm glad you let me load for you instead of shooting me." "Best decision I ever made," Josephine said, echoing his words from years earlier. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. From inside the house came the sounds of Mary helping her mother prepare supper, and Thomas the younger's voice as he told his children a story. The spring still bubbled under the cottonwoods, still provided water for the ranch and the neighbors who paid for access. The land still stretched out around them, harsh and beautiful and theirs. "We did it," Josephine said softly. "We held the last acre, and then we built something lasting on it." "We did indeed," Samuel agreed. He reached over and took her hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of decades of practice. "I love you, Josephine Frost." "I love you, Samuel Frost," she replied. "My cowboy who rode up and offered to load for me, my partner, my husband, my love." They sat together as the stars emerged and the desert cooled. Two people who'd faced down threats and challenges and come out stronger on the other side. The widow who'd held her last acre with a rifle and the cowboy who'd offered to stand beside her had built a life, a family, and a legacy that would endure for generations. The ranch would continue, passed down to their children and grandchildren, each generation adding their own story to the land. The water rights business Josephine had started would evolve and grow, eventually becoming a formal water cooperative that served the entire region. The partnership and love between Samuel and Josephine would be remembered and celebrated, a story told to children and grandchildren about courage, determination, and the power of standing together. But that night, sitting on the porch under the vast Texas sky, they were simply Samuel and Josephine, husband and wife, partners in all things, exactly as they'd promised to be that day when Samuel had ridden up and changed both their lives forever. The end.